I've always winced when I hear Neil Young and Crazy Horse, because it's really Crazy Horse, and I know it's really Crazy Horse. For instance, my new jacket doesn't say Neil Young on it. Everybody else says Neil Young and Crazy Horse. Mine just says Crazy Horse.
Tonight's the Night was finally released in June 1975. Neil had called a playback session for a new album provisionally entitled Homegrown. On the second side of the open reel tape was the basis for Tonight's the Night. The assembled company listened to it and were amazed. Homegrown was summarily consigned to oblivion. With Neil's vocal style always a point of contention, Tonight's the Night was the studio album that would divide the world between those who liked Neil Young and those who couldn't see what the fuss was all about. As Jack Nietzsche put it, everyone's fooled because they think they should like him. If you don't like Neil Young, how funky are you? By now, Neil's son Zeke had been diagnosed with mild cerebral palsy, whose symptoms were later largely corrected, and his relationship with Carrie Snodgrass was on the slide. He had abruptly walked out of a session to try to complete the elusive second Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young album, and felt he had come out of the dark period that had been dominating his life. After the release of Tonight's the Night, Young embarked on a period of intense creativity, with no relationship to distract him. Zuma, the new album with Crazy Horse, was recorded with new member Frank Poncho Sampredo. The album seemed to spark a critical renaissance for Neil, and its core composition, Cortez the Killer, was an astonishing triumph. The closing track also featured all four members of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young on the reflective Sailboat song, providing a unique glimpse of both sides to Neil's split musical life. Despite all this, Zuma barely managed the UK top 50. As 1975 drew to a close, Neil underwent surgery to remove a node from his throat that had prevented him singing. And he and Crazy Horse set off on a tour of small clubs and bars inspired by Dylan's Rolling Thunder review of the same year. In January 1976, plans were revealed for a collaborative album with Stephen Stills. The result, Long May You Run, was heralded as a return to the glory days of Buffalo Springfield, complete with the attendant grind and spark of their famous guitar dueling. As it happened, Long May You Run was a 4-star dud, a dreary trawl through some of the pair's weakest collective and individual moments. Nonetheless, they embarked on a grueling tour, which Neil left halfway through with little or no explanation. Despite this, he and Stills reconvened in the autumn for the band's farewell concert and film extravaganza, The Last Waltz. A special effects sequence had to be devised to disguise the presence of a large white rock of cocaine jammed up Neil's nose. Reveling in his newfound freedom as a bachelor, Young moved into a house with a posse of male friends and joined their boys-only bar band, The Ducks, whose members included a one-time acquaintance from the Buffalo Springfield days, Jeff Blackburn, formerly of Moby Grape. The Ducks had their own special brand of humor, which required the audience to quack at key points in their set, and recorded a double live album which remains locked in Neil's legendary private vault, in which there must be enough unreleased material to fill the center of the earth. His tenure with the Ducks ended when the identity of their new guitarist became public knowledge. In the spring of 1977, work began on a new batch of recordings under the working title Chrome Dreams. However, somewhere along the line these plans fell apart, and in June, American Stars and Bars was released. Though announced originally as a concept album, part American history, part social comment, those intentions also came to nothing. With Linda Ronstadt and Neil's short-term girlfriend Nicolette Larson on vocals, much of it was recorded in one afternoon, during what the two women assumed was a run-through. Although containing the classic Like a Hurricane, American Stars and Bars was uneven and frustrating. By contrast, Crosby, Stills and Nash had captured the charts with their new album, getting rave reviews wherever they went. Young's production rate was cranked up a further notch for Decade, a 3-LP retrospective of his career thus far, with the inclusion of 5 previously unreleased tracks to whet the public's appetite. Rapturously received, it put Neil back in favor, and he began yet more work, this time with an ensemble of top session musicians called the Gone with the Wind Orchestra. Featuring Nicolette Larson on vocals, the tracks would form the core of the album Comes a Time, released in September 1978. Hailed as the natural successor to Harvest, it endeared Young once again to the crossover audience that had been waiting 6 years for the chance to say they liked Neil Young again. By this time, Neil had married Peggy Morton, who was heavily pregnant with his second son, Ben. More anguish arose when it was revealed that the new baby, like Zeke, his firstborn, also suffered from cerebral palsy, though this time the condition was much worse, and Ben would be confined to a wheelchair all his life. All this distracted attention form an unfortunate footnote to the Neil Young liaison with Carrie Snodgrass, who went on to become romantically involved with Jack Nietzsche. During a heavy row, he was alleged to have pushed a gun into her vagina, though she later claimed that he had only stuck it between her legs. So fine a distinction obviously made all the difference between such star-crossed lovers.
I don't want to be, I mean, it's too late, it's all retrospect now, but to be, I think the way we've lasted is by avoiding the kind of success that can injure you.
Neil had first encountered punk on a visit to the UK in 1976. What he appreciated was its mission to strip rock back to its basics, reinvesting it with fresh drive and energy, and its contempt for the bloated, conservative-minded old-school rock stars and their tiresome stadium gig mentality. He was further delighted to learn that his contemporaries hated it. Fortunately for Crosby, Stills and Nash, who personified the kind of acts that punks loved to loathe, this attitude did not immediately cross the Atlantic. Here the resurgence of bohemian art rock was confined to the small clubs in such metropolitan centers as New York, where artists like Patti Smith, Television, Talking Heads, and Jonathan Richman's Modern Lovers were wooing a new generation. While Young was gathering footage for his latest movie venture, Dean Stockwell took him to see Devo, an American new wave situationist group with a healthy regard for the surreal. Two of their members ran a t-shirt printing business to supplement their income, and one of their logos was comprised of 3 words: Rust never sleeps. Neil seized upon it as the buzzword for his new LP. After a 2-week vacation with Peggy, he embarked on a 25-date tour with Crazy Horse, using a number of props and theatrical devices to stage an ambitious show. Between the acoustic first half and the high-energy, ear-crunching electric set, audiences were subjected to the recordings of the Woodstock announcement warning revelers to avoid the brown acid. Not all the critics were convinced, with accusations that such theatrics diminished the integrity of the music. In July 1979, Rust Never Sleeps, the album which re-established Neil as a major creative force, was released to mass critical acclaim. For once he had marshaled the best material of recent years and had secured winning performances from Crazy Horse that were beyond reproach. The LP was divided into one acoustic and one electric side, opening and closing with 2 versions of the same song, My, Hey, Hey, Out of the Blue, expressing the contentious notion that it was better to burn out than fade away. Whatever might become of individual artists, rock and roll would never die. Young used, as an example to strengthen his argument, the case of Johnny Rotten, soon to be known by his given name John Lydon, the charismatic and outspoken singer of the Sex Pistols. By choosing an icon loved and loathed in equal measure, Young was plainly declaring his belief that the punks had been right, that rock music had become fat, smug and corrupt, and that a shake-up had been sorely needed. Furthermore, John Lydon had moved on and had resisted the opportunity to constantly milk his fearsome reputation, becoming a sad caricature of himself in the style of Mick Jagger and Rod Stewart. Young clearly hoped that he would be seen to be doing the same. The album contained oblique references to Crosby, Stills and Nash, whose transformation into singing businessmen Neil regarded with wary contempt, and closed with a blistering revision of the first song, Hey Hey My Into the Black. The record earned Young his best reviews for several years and was accompanied by a concert film directed by Young himself with a double live soundtrack album. It was the pinnacle of his late 70s work and a triumphant way to end the decade. Unfortunately, it would be a long time before he would reach those dizzy heights again.
With Geffen, they had to know the name of the album. What's the name of this album? What project are we working on? Then I'd hand it in and say, I'm doing this. And they'd say, no, you can't do that. It says in the contract, for 90 days, after album number 2, you have to go to sleep. I mean, they had me all wrong.
As Neil Young entered the 1980s, uppermost in his mind was the health of his second son, Ben. He and Peggy embarked on an extensive program of therapy, aimed in part at trying to teach Ben to communicate. It proved extremely arduous. To compound Neil's difficult domestic situation, Peggy Young was diagnosed with a serious brain condition that would need dangerous surgery to correct. Happily, the operation was a success, but the episode prompted Young to devote his energies to his family, with his music taking second place. Young's first album of the 80s was the patchy and inconsistent Hawks and Doves, released in October 1980, which mirrored American Stars and Bars in its division into two distinct styles. One side bore gentle acoustic songs, the other heavy-handed country stomps, barely supporting clumsy political satire. The record had its moments of brilliance, making it all the more frustrating. Its follow-up, Reactor, was blighted with the same problem. A compilation album of the best songs from Stars and Bars, Hawks and Doves, and Reactor would have shown beyond doubt that Neil Young still had what it took to write great songs, but like Dylan, he seemed to have difficulty recognizing which was suitable for release and which were crap. Perhaps with all the turmoil at home to deal with, this was understandable. As Johnny Rogan has noted in his exhaustive biography of Neil Young, this was Young with the emotional shutters pulled down. John Lennon's assassination in New York in December 1980 was a bad start to a new decade. The election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency brought echoes of Hollywood and America's mythic cowboy past, where all was black and white, goodies and baddies, with Reagan as the arbiter of each. Lennon had been the great white hope of David Geffen's newly inaugurated record label called simply Geffen. With his top star dead, he was keen to bag another. Enter Neil Young, who had severed his connections with Reprise after 13 years and was looking for a new deal. With his manager Elliot Roberts assuring him that Geffen was the man for him because of his open-mindedness and his understanding that Neil was a mercurial artist who could neither be controlled nor be expected to stick with one style, everything looked set to be agreeable to both parties. The full irony of these words would be revealed over time. Things got off to a poor start when Neil submitted his first album for the label to be entitled Island in the Sun. The company rejected it. Young returned to the drawing board and came up with a synth-pop LP inspired by Kraftwerk. The record's central theme was the difficulty of human communication, developed during therapy sessions with his son Ben. The result was Trans, released in January 1983. Though not completely disastrous, it was nevertheless a strange album, with many of its vocals obscured by the use of a vocoder, a device which reduces human speech to barely intelligible sounds. Matters were not improved when he unveiled plans for his next effort, Old Ways, a country and western record which was also rejected. Geffen were wary of that idea too, claiming that it was rock that was selling, and it was rock they wanted. Accordingly, Neil returned a while later with a pastiche rockabilly album that stands as one of the most disappointing ever made by any artist anywhere at any time. Everybody's Rockin' by Neil and the Shocking Pinks represents the nadir of Young's colourful recording career. Nor was the worst over. On November the 5th, 1983, Young was served with a writ by Geffen's solicitor's office giving notice that he was being sued for making records that were uncharacteristic of his music. While all this was happening, Peggy became pregnant again, and Neil's brother Bob was in court for drug smuggling. David Crosby, one of the most brilliant musicians of his generation, had succumbed to freebasing cocaine, was facing a drug-related prison sentence, and was generally regarded to be a dead man walking. Freebasing involves cooking the cocaine to turn it into a substance similar to crack, and Crosby was seldom seen without his Cook's oxyacetylene blowtorch. Friends and other musicians had taken to carrying personal fire extinguishers in case Crosby should accidentally set them alight. And when in court, he was so exhausted that he snored loudly throughout the proceedings. Peggy gave birth to a perfectly normal baby girl called Amber. David Crosby went to prison for 3 years, and Neil Young decided to become a full-time country singer, forming a band called the International Harvesters, and telling David Geffen that if he thought Old Ways was uncharacteristic, then he would prove him wrong by singing country and western for the rest of his life.
How do you live without that? How do you live without the songs you're hanging your hat on? How do you go out there and make the set work without them? Give them a rest. They're golden. You got to give them a rest. You put them away. Let them. Don't pay any more attention to it. That's the way we try to do it. That's the way I try to call the shots on the stage when we're out there.
Neil Young took his role as good old country boy to heart, complete with appearances at the Grand Ole Opry. Reactionary political outbursts and homilies uttered about the strength of family and the joys of passing the black-eyed beans around the table at dinner time. Live Aid, a one-day benefit concert in support of the millions starving in Africa, organized by Boomtown Rats main man Bob Geldof, gave several big-name acts the welcome chance to revitalize stalled careers. When headliner Bob Dylan later took the stage, he made a passing remark about organizing a similar event for America's beleaguered farmers, many of whom were facing bankruptcy due to escalating mortgage costs. Dylan and Young discussed the matter after the concert, and Willie Nelson was brought on board to persuade his golfing buddy, the governor of Illinois, to get them a stadium. Young assumed the Bob Geldof role, speaking to the farmers, and 3 months later Farm Aid was born. The inaugural concert, staged on the 22nd of September 1985, featured Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, Joni Mitchell, B.B. King, John Fogerty, the Beach Boys, Roy Orbison, and Randy Newman. On the country team were Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Johnny Cash, Merle Haggard, Emmylou Harris, and Kenny Rogers. Old Ways was finally released in August 1985 and was a mixed bag of mawkish horrors alongside 1 or 2 songs of convincing merit, but the overwhelming feeling at the time was that by now no one really cared, including Neil Young. A year later, Farm Aid 2 took rather less money than its predecessor. Reflecting Neil's personal interests was the founding of the Bridge School Benefit, a charity organized by Neil and Peggy to assist handicapped children. Star-studded concerts would be held over successive years. By now, Neil was tired of being a hayseed and woke up one morning with a buzzing noise in his head, which seemed to be God telling him to go back to rock and roll. Accordingly, in August 1986, Young released a synth rock album recorded with Crazy Horse, Landing on Water, a complete turkey that time seems to have conspired to forget. Much the same could be said for Life, released 11 months later in July 1987. By now, his stock was so low in both Britain and America that it seemed as if nothing could save him, and he was consigned to the great rock and roll Hall of Tragedies, from which he would very shortly make his spectacular escape.
I suppose if I spend a year and a half, 2 years making 10 tracks, I spent a year and a half on Freedom, but I recorded 32 songs.
Between the albums Landing on Water and Life, Young had embarked on a long tour with Crazy Horse, their first for 8 years, and had participated in an attempt to reunite Buffalo Springfield, which was well-intentioned but unsuccessful. On October 7, 1987, Young's manager rang to inform him that his contract with Geffen Records had finally expired. This seemed to coincide with the spark of a new life beginning. Now back with Reprise, he began to work on fresh material that had been the result of a reunion with the Squires in June of that year. Rocking R&B spiced up with a horn section. Young called his new music Power Swing and christened the band he had pulled together to play it the Blue Notes. April 1988 saw the release of This Note's for You, Young's most competent and accessible work of the 80s to date. British film director Julian Temple directed a video to promote the title track, in which various mainstream artists, including Eric Clapton and Michael Jackson, were gently mocked, as was the overall concept of corporate sponsorship of rock music, against which Neil was speaking out. In a dramatic turnaround, MTV relented and ended up voting the film promo Video of the Year. 1988 also marked the release of the first Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young record for 18 years, which could be seen as a bittersweet document of lost opportunities and the effects of time on the participants' art. A few months later, Neil released a limited edition EP, El Dorado, which contained some fine new material, and provided the basis for a full-length album released on October 10, 1989, called Freedom. Conceived in a format similar to Rust Never Sleeps, with 2 versions of Rocking in the Free World bookending the record, it was generally voted his best record of the decade and a fine return to form. The trick was repeated the following year when he recorded an album of no-nonsense full-tilt garage boogie in the barn of his ranch home with Crazy Horse, re-establishing the partnership as one of the most exciting in rock. Ragged Glory was everything its name implied, a vindication of the simple virtues of playing uncomplicated music according to feel rather than strict technical guidelines. In timeless young mode, it mixed old songs with new, and it seemed like the 80s had never happened. Death, illness, and madness reared their ugly heads again with reports of Young's mother's terminal cancer, with Dallas Taylor awaiting a liver transplant and Rick James's descent into hardline crack addiction. With Young back in fashion, the time was right for a new generation of rock musicians to regard him as their spiritual godfather, mindful of the fact that at the end of the 70s he had championed the dinosaur-baiting punk movement, and that during the 80s he had been nobody's man but his own, following his individual path no matter what the cost, while all around him hid their faces for shame. The flagship band of the new movement, named Grunge according to their adherents' sense of willful shabbiness, was Nirvana, the brainchild of dysfunctional neo-hippie Kurt Cobain. Nirvana took a world gone stale and kicked it back to life, recording a seminal album called Nevermind. With a title that nodded respect to the Sex Pistols, and with songs that were the best by leagues of its time, the album shot Cobain to the kind of fame a sensitive soul can't survive. Young compounded his own sense of revitalization by touring with avant-rock outfit Sonic Youth, whose guitarist, Thurston Moore, encouraged him to trademark the brutal sonic feedback evident in his recent work, supplementing his latest live double album Weld with an optional extra called Arc. This was a mini-album collage of distortion and feedback which formed Young's most adventurous release to date.
It's a constant battle. I want it to be easy too, you know. I want to sing Rockin' in the Free World because it kicked their ass last night. There's a war going on. I don't think I'll ever quit the music business. I don't really know how I'm going to live in it, but I think I'll find my own way.
Young followed the raucous Weld with an album recorded 20 years after Harvest, but using the same musicians. Though he protested that Harvest Moon was not Harvest Part 2, it may as well have been. A sidestep from his recent output, it was the sound of a man settling into middle age, reflecting on the past. Neil described it as his most female record, acknowledging the stability that his wife Peggy had brought to his life. It was his first album to reach the UK top 10 since Harvest itself. 1993 saw a Geffen Records compilation Lucky 13, which made some belated sense of that strange period, and a session for MTV in their Unplugged series, which gave Young the chance to revisit some old material, often with startling results. As the album entered the UK top 5, a tour began with the group that had acted as house band for the extensive Bob Dylan tribute gigs of October 1992, Booker T and the MGs. Neil marvelled at their proficiency, claiming that they were the tightest band with whom he had ever played. Those who attended the gigs and hoped for a collaborative album would have to wait 9 years for 2002's Are You Passionate? In January 1994, Young was nominated for an Oscar for his contribution to the soundtrack of the film Philadelphia, but was beaten to the winning post by Bruce Springsteen. Then came disaster. Kurt Cobain took the only route out of his mess of a life that seemed possible. He put a shotgun in his mouth and evacuated his brains via the back of his skull. His suicide note left for his widow Courtney Love quoted Young's "Hey, hey, my." It was better to burn out, Cobain had written, than to fade away. Young was appalled by Cobain's death, particularly as he had been trying to get Nirvana to play on his latest tour. The event triggered one of his most affecting albums. Sleeps with Angels was rated alongside Tonight's the Night, the account of the wake held for Danny Whitten more than 20 years previously. A top 10 hit in both the UK and the US, it received considerable critical acclaim. In January 1995, Neil Young was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the ultimate accolade for any self-respecting rock artist. Responsible for this induction was Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam, with whom Young would record his next album, Mirabal, released to mixed reviews in June 1995 and with an attendant tour. Although the album introduced him to a new ready-made audience, there was to be no follow-up. A few months later, Young received the sad news that his longtime producer David Briggs had died of cancer. In early 1996, Young provided the soundtrack for Jim Jarmusch's excellent film Dead Man. During March and April of the same year, he and Crazy Horse performed a series of gigs in a limited-capacity bar near his La Honda ranch, billed as The Echoes. This was followed by a desultory album, Broken Arrow, Young's first critical defeat of the 90s. Towards the end of the year, both Crosby, Stills and Nash and Buffalo Springfield were also inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And as 1997 arrived, speculation began in earnest about the long-awaited archive box set of unreleased Neil Young material, rumours of which have persisted ever since, with some reports claiming it to have reached a staggering 32 CDs. Later that year, another live album with Crazy Horse, The Year of the Horse, presented the latest installment in their joint saga. A film of the same name, directed by Jim Jarmusch, celebrating their long-standing and eventful association, was a delight. The 11th Bridge School benefit and the sad news of Nicolette Larson's death from cancer completed the year. As the millennium approached, Young lapsed into an uncharacteristically quiet period. Apart from a single track on each of 3 projects, a Booker T and the MGs box set, a Bridge School concert album, and a benefit album for Kosovan refugees, little was heard of him, save for his participation on Looking Forward, the new Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young album released in October 1999. This dire record made it clear that whatever the group had had nearly 30 years previously, they'd long since given away. 2000 saw the release of the much-anticipated Silver and Gold, a low-key affair in a similar idiom to Harvest Moon, continuing the precedent set with Broken Arrow of naming an album after an old song. Though lacking cohesion, the record pleased long-term fans and obsessives and gathered mostly positive reviews. A compilation album of Farm-Aid concerts included 3 songs by Young, and a live album, Road Rock, featuring a variety of friends and relatives as indicated on the front cover, sold poorly and did little to enhance Young's presence in the 21st century. In 2001, a second compilation of tracks from the Geffen era, Mystery Train, preceded one of the year's more welcome releases, a long-planned 4-CD Buffalo Springfield box set which gathered rare and unreleased tracks and placed them among the officially released material, with the sound quality of the earlier demos proving a revelation. Then, in 2002, came the long-awaited collaboration with Booker T and the MGs, the studio album entitled Are You Passionate? Gathering muted reviews, the record turned out to be generally low-key, with the opening track's riff borrowed from Time Is Tight, an early Stax Days Booker T number, and with Young's guitar tasteful and economic. The real clunker was Let's Roll, the ill-advised tribute song to the events of September the 11th, 2001, with its gung-ho references to going after Satan on the wings of a dove, echoing his equally embarrassing support for Ronald Reagan during Young's reactionary phase of the 1980s. A box set of the band's Last Waltz LP, remastered with extra tracks, provided more for the die-hard fans to consider, and with the summer season of outdoor festivals approaching, thoughts began to turn to the prospect of a tour, and to the eventual fate of Crazy Horse, languishing in repose since Broken Arrow in 1996. Time has been kind to Neil Young. Unlike other artists of his era, he has shown the ability to take chances, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to be true to himself no matter what the cost. In the words of the song recorded with Stephen Stills, which formed a sentimental tribute to his old black hearse, "Long may he run."
Thanks for buying Maximum Neil Young. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.